I'm also find it very puzzling that large segment of the Republican establishment that also is trying to normalize illegal immigration and say that the rule of law doesn't matter. If conservatives should stand for one thing, it should be the sanctity of the rule of law.
We were talking about Rudy Giuliani as a reforming mayor in New York and as a kind of galvanizing figure, really, in the urban reform that swept all across the country, in policing, among other things, as you were saying. Why was Giuliani able to be so successful in New York?
He was a very good rhetorician. He was very persuasive, and he believed in ideas. This was something very different from our subsequent mayor, who had very good instincts in public safety and welfare, but didn't care to articulate them. Giuliani was constantly involved in public education about crime. We have to fight crime, that there's no excuse for it. You can't make a race excuse, and that the inner city minority residents need public safety more than anybody else, and that it is not racist to send police where they are needed. And Giuliani, he was combative, he loved the fight, and he didn't give a damn what the New York Times said about him. It is the downfall of politicians that they care about the New York Times. It's the first thing they look at in the morning. He didn't. And he was willing to speak what he felt was right. And you need that in a city like New York with its incredible history of liberal assumptions and the facile striving for self-righteousness by voting for redistributionist politics.
I would guess, too, that the fact that New York has a strong mayor system compared to Los Angeles must make some significant difference as well.
Possibly so. And we have an idiotic city council, which doesn't distinguish us from the LA City Council.
Not at all.
No. It's hard to know. I mean, if you had I think if Giuliani was in LA, I think he could probably still get things done.
Right.
It really is an example of the great man theory of history, that he was just unique in his force of will and his ability to articulate a vision.
You're one of the few journalists who write extensively both about New York City politics and New York politics, New York State politics to some extent, and California politics. Which state do you think is more troubled at this point in terms of its public policy and its likely future?
Wow. Well, California is blessed with its amazing geography and land mass. There's up and down the coast, there's just one gorgeous spot after another. New York State is basically New York and then a void. There's very little up there. I think that California is really showing what the future of this country looks like if its present immigration course stays on track. We are a generation or two ahead in seeing the effects of large-scale, low-skilled mass immigration. And that is another subject that is not really allowed to be spoken of in California. But I think it lies behind a lot of the budget woes and the social and economic woes that the state is really has not been able to claw its way out of so far.
What sort of grade would you give Jerry Brown this time around as a chief executive?
He's disappointed me. I think he has a much greater capacity to be a reformer than he has been. I don't think he's taken on the unions to the extent he should have, or welfare spending. He has completely kowtowed to the Latino caucus as far as further decimating the rule of law in this state.
You've written about the lack of social capital as a kind of underlying problem in recent Hispanic immigration to California, legal and illegal, but mostly illegal, I guess. Describe that, and why is that troublesome in the long term?
They are not rising as fast as they should be, because they are not passing on the predominant importance of education to their children, and instead their kids are joining the underclass. The second and third generation is assimilating downwards. California just passed a $156 billion budget. This is astronomical. The vast majority of that budget goes towards trying to close the achievement gap between Hispanics on the one hand and whites and Asians on the other. And it's not succeeding. We're spending more and more money. Jerry Brown passed a very controversial law that would redistribute state education dollars from successful schools to failing schools that are failing because their students are failing, that have high proportions of English learners. Now, this is an interesting category in California, English learner. One would assume, coming at this from scratch, that it means somebody who has just come from Mexico and grew up in an all-Spanish environment. But in fact, English learners in California are often students who've been born here all their lives, but their cognitive skills are so low, their language skills are so low, that they are classified as English learners through high school, even though, and they've never been in a bilingual school environment because we've gotten rid of bilingual education. Nevertheless, they are not getting from their parents the reading instruction, the homework insistence that is happening in, say, Asian families. And so what we're seeing, liberals should be paying attention. To the extent that you think income inequality is a problem, and we can debate whether it is or it isn't, but the ongoing mass immigration of people that come from largely peasant backgrounds that have the low social capital is going to lead to greater and greater income polarization in this state and eventually in the country, because we are not producing the college graduates that we need in order to fuel the engine of Silicon Valley. So wages are going to go up there. Meanwhile, another thing that amazes me with liberal support for mass low-skilled immigration, they should care about the laws of supply and demand and wages. The ongoing influx of low-skilled immigrants are driving wages down, not just for Native Americans, predominantly black, but for immigrants who have already been here. So you're getting the polarization that is going to get harder and harder to overcome.
And you're not getting pushback from unions.
No, they've
either.
decided they just want the votes. I mean, there's paradoxes on both sides of this. I'm also find it very puzzling that large segment of the Republican establishment that also is trying to normalize illegal immigration and say that the rule of law doesn't matter. If conservatives should stand for one thing, it should be the sanctity of the rule of law. But now you have the Republican establishment that holds on to this myth that if they can just put amnesty and illegal and immigration enforcement behind them, that low-skilled Hispanics will be this trove of Republicans waiting to happen, is diluted. The Democrats understand that the poor Hispanics are a natural constituency for the Democratic Party.
Right.
And they vote for Democrats not on the immigration issue, but on the issue of big government and social services and taxes. Poll after poll shows that the low-skilled Hispanic population, why they don't vote for Republicans is because they associate them with wealthy and with small government. They want higher taxes and more social services.
And would you say that this problem is cultural in origins? It's partly, well, that problem is partly income driven, a class problem, if you would, but the social deficits, the lack of high esteem for education and of transmitting a kind of culture of high standards in educational terms to children is a cultural problem, and does that fact or that hypothesis make you more optimistic or pessimistic about policies to improve or change that?
Well, the fact that it's cultural makes me pessimistic about policy, because I think policy is naive very often about culture. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, culture is very profound and very long-lasting. And the naivete of policymakers that they can simply rejigger the tax code, say, and think that they can reform individual decision-making, I think is enormous.
Were there other ethnic groups, immigrant groups, previously in American history that had the same kind of deficits that were overcome? I mean, Italians are often mentioned as a group that did not particularly value education when as a wave of immigrants they came over at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. But they have gone on to, scale the ladder of higher education and income as well.
Mm-hmm. But it was a very different time. You had an economy that still had a voracious appetite for manual labor. And we also had an immigration pause in the 1920s when our immigration laws were scaled back. And they stayed scaled back until really 1965, when we opened up the floodgates and decided we needed diversity tests and wanted to change the ethnic composition of this country. But there's no end in sight right now. So what you have is a constant flow of new immigrants coming, bringing the same cultural values that makes it harder and harder to assimilate. With more and more people coming in, there's less of a chance of finding a common culture again.
And I suppose one of the problems in acculturation would be the schools and education, about which we will say more.